Winters in Northeast Ohio can be nasty. This is the site of the long-gone Brady Lake Amusement Park between Kent and Ravenna, Ohio. Believe it or not, a circus once called this place home, and it was in the winter. Men and animals spent 5 frosty months in 1944-1945. Why would they do that? Welcome to When the Circus Came to Brady Lake. It was late November 1944. The Bailey Brothers Circus was giving its last show of the season. Performers, crew, even the animals were exhausted. They were finishing a grueling 7-month tour. In 27 weeks, they had given 326 performances in 161 towns. They had traveled more than 10,000 miles through 18 states. The tour had started in May in Bowling Green, Ohio, made its way around 1/3 of the country, and finally ended in Lexington, North Carolina. Most folks were headed to winter quarters. For some of them, that would be 465 miles away in tiny Brady Lake, Ohio. Not all the 250 Brady Lake performers, crew, and managers made the trip north. On all traveling circuses, most of the performers and many of the animals went home to warm weather states. There they would get some badly needed rest from the hectic 2-show-a-day schedule they had endured for the past 6 or 7 months. But for a hardy crew of workers and officials of the Bailey Brothers Circus, balmy Brady Lake was where they would spend the winter of 1944-45. Bailey Brothers was a motorized or truck circus. Old motion pictures would have you believe that circuses traveled in relative luxury on private trains. That would have been only partly true 50 years earlier. In the late 19th century, there were 15 or so railroad shows that regularly crisscrossed the country, performing in the larger cities on the train line. Smaller towns were served by horse-drawn circuses on roads that were at the mercy of the weather. They were called mud shows for good reason. By the 1940s, most circuses were traveling by motorized vehicles. By then, there were only 1 or 2 large circuses that had the money to travel by railroad. Ringling Brothers and Cole Brothers were the best known. The smaller motorized outfits, there were about 20 of them, jumped from town to town, state to state, in caravans of trucks, trailers, buses, and campers. And it wasn't easy. The Depression of the 1930s had decimated the circus industry, as it had most segments of the economy. Then came the Second World War. Carnivals, amusement parks, and circuses were hit hard again. The war drained away men, money, and materials. A truck circus depended on gasoline, rubber, canvas, rope, and steel. There were limits, rationing, on all of them during the war. The Bailey Brothers Circus felt that pinch during their stay at Brady Lake. An amusement park in Northeast Ohio probably seems like a strange place for a circus to spend the winter. It was cold. It snowed a lot. It was isolated. Most circuses had their winter quarters in the South. There was only one reason for the Bailey Brothers Circus to spend 5 frigid months in Northeast Ohio. And for that, you have to go back to the history of the old park. Brady Lake Park had opened in 1891 as a beautiful rustic resort, catering to the middle class in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Brady Lake, the park, was pretty much interchangeable with Brady Lake, the village. They overlapped each other. The town had been created in 1927 as a political ploy to protect ballroom dancing at the park. The village had one main road and less than 200 residents. There were a couple of general stores, a gas station, streetcar station, barber shop, and post office. The entire village was under 1 square mile in size. Mostly, it was a huge cluster of summer cottages scattered around the lake. By the late 1930s, the park had been a popular amusement spot for 4 decades. But by November 1944, when the Bailey Brothers Circus was crawling into town, it had become a seedy shadow of its former self. The park had been taken over by organized crime in 1942. The so-called Cleveland Syndicate had turned it into one of its prime gambling locations. Legal bingo games drew huge crowds with nightly jackpots of $1,000 or more. Illegal slot machines, though, were the heartbeat of the syndicate's operation. Brady Lake Park had hundreds of them. For a nickel, quarter, or a $50, you could crank the handle and try your luck. Luck, of course, rarely had anything to do with winning. The syndicate saw to that. The mob's manager at Brady Lake Park was Edward Kleinman. He was a businessman, lawyer, and family man from Cleveland Heights. He also was related to one of the original members of the Cleveland Syndicate. When it bought Brady Lake Park, Kleinman became the manager. That was why, in November 1944, the Bailey Brothers Circus was pulling into Brady Lake Park to spend the winter. Kleinman and the syndicate had taken over the circus. Eight months earlier, in March 1944, Ed Kleinman had filed incorporation papers with the state of Ohio. They made him and 3 associates the owners of the Bailey Brothers Circus. That was how the syndicate did business. Friends and associates would lend their names to a syndicate deal. In return, they would get a small cut of the earnings. The syndicate did the investing and reaped the bulk of the profits. It was a small, tightly knit, hush-hush organization. Indeed, it was called the Silent Syndicate. It dated back decades in Cleveland to its rum-running operation during Prohibition. By the 40s, it was heavily into illegal gambling, especially slot machines. Its business model resembled a remarkable rat maze of seemingly unconnected enterprises in all sectors of the local economy. They range from ice cream stores to laundries to construction outfits, from cigarette vending machines to car washes to real estate. So why would the syndicate want to run a circus? There were three possibilities. First, to hide money. Use the circus as a vehicle to launder illegal income from liquor sales or slot machines. Second, to make money legally. They may have thought an investment in a circus would generate a decent financial return. Or third, make money illegally. Perhaps they envisioned adding slot machines to the circus's sideshow. Ed Kleinman's family didn't care about the reason. His son once recalled that, as a boy, he was just thrilled to learn his dad had bought a circus. Bob Stevens was 47 and a circus lifer. He had been in and around circuses and carnies for more than 30 years. He had worked the sideshows and the arcades, done advance work, and handled promotion, tickets, and banners. He was a character. One elephant trainer called him blustery. A competitor considered him ill-mannered and uncouth. Stevens was a showman and a wheeler dealer. He was in or out of the money, and when he was in the money, he liked to spread it around to friends and family. His given name was Les Stevenson, but he had it changed to Bob Stevens, reportedly to avoid someone or something in his past. Stevens had friends in the Cleveland-based Mills Brothers Circus and in the Cleveland Grotto Circus run by the Shriners. In 1943, he had decided he wanted to operate his own show. He let his Cleveland circus friends know he was looking for financial backing. An associate of the syndicate somehow heard about it and put the parties together. Stevens' announcement that he was starting a new circus came not surprisingly about the same time Kleinman filed those incorporation papers. Nor is it a coincidence that Stevens began using Ed Kleinman's business address, 705 NBC Building, Cleveland, as his own. Advertisements for equipment and performers advised interested parties to contact Stevens at his new Cleveland address or at Brady Lake Park. No syndicate members were named as owners of the circus, in keeping with their business model. Publicly, Bob Stevens was listed as owner and manager. The mob was a very silent partner. The syndicate had a promising new business opportunity. Stevens had a financial backer with deep pockets. It seemed to be a perfect symbiotic relationship. In reality, that relationship would work out for only one of them. Bob Stevens may have worked just about every job in a circus, but he had never owned one. Before the Cleveland Syndicate took over financial control, he had bought on the cheap some equipment and some canvas. That's circus talk for the huge tents that housed the Big Top, Sideshow, and Menagerie. He had hired some second-tier acts. The syndicate had taken financial control of the circus just before the start of the 1944 season, so Stevens was able to put only a small amount of syndicate money into his fledgling venture. Stevens clearly had his eyes on the 1945 season and beyond, when he could take full advantage of syndicate money. For the short time he had to put everything together, it wasn't a bad first effort. He had most of the requisite acts for a three-ring circus: acrobats, aerialists, clowns, horses, a lion and tiger act, a band, a sideshow, and a menagerie. The 1944 season started well. The Bailey outfit stayed on the road. Some circuses weren't able to do that. Attendance was promising. Newspaper reviews were favorable. Stevens felt good enough about his show that he ran a large, boastful ad in Billboard magazine.
The show they said would never open has opened and is packing them in. It owes no bills and pays cash for everything. It is well financed with an assembly of America's best circus people.
Compared to other truck circuses, though, the 1944 show was short on quantity and quality. And there was one big thing missing from Stevens' show for sure. He had started the 1944 tour without one prize performer, a trained elephant. Circuses by nature were menageries on wheels. They had monkeys, dogs, horses, lions, tigers, and elephants. Of them all, the elephant, not the lion, was the king of circus beasts. They gave the circus status. The mammoth animals were extremely popular with audiences. Their immense size and strange appearance contrasted with their amazing dexterity, intelligence, and nimble-footedness. And they literally pulled their weight, helping raise tents and performing other difficult jobs. Stevens may not have had an elephant when he started the 1944 season, but in the middle of that initial tour, he got an opportunity to buy one. It did not go well. In early 1929, Ruth was about 18 years old, weighed several thousand pounds, and had an ornery streak. "18 months earlier, the Asian elephant had been seriously injured when struck by a streetcar after a show. Now mostly healed, she was performing in a circus in Peru, Indiana, and she was for sale. 50 miles away in Lafayette, Indiana, the Columbian Park Zoo was searching for an elephant to anchor its new animal house. When the zoo heard that Ruth was available, and not too expensive, it decided to buy her. The zoo made the purchase a community effort. School kids would lead the fundraising. The school that donated the most money would get to name the elephant. The fundraising drive was wildly popular and successful. The children of Lincoln School were the winners. They named, or in this case renamed, Elephant Ruth as Linko after their school. Linko became a local rock star. People flocked to the park to see and ride her. For the next 10 years, the zoo and the community embraced the growing elephant. But as was the case with many captive elephants, Linko was having some problems. She seemed lethargic, was out of shape, and had begun to limp. Within a few years, Linko was also going blind in one eye and becoming unruly, if not dangerous. By 1944, 15 years after she became the pride and joy of the zoo, she was for sale again. Enter Bob Stevens. he heard about Linko being for sale. He leaped at the chance to get a former circus elephant, a trained performer, to help headline his show. The 1944 season was half over. Stevens quickly bought Linko from the zoo. He gave her back her old name, Ruth. Circus staff tried to retrain her, without complete success. A month after joining Bailey Brothers, she staged a sit-down strike in the middle of a busy road in Kankakee, Illinois. The 3-ton animal sat down and refused to budge. Traffic backed up. Horns were honking. Drivers were shouting. Newspapers reported that Ruth became irked. She rolled over, swung around her huge trunk, and knocked down a street lamppost. Finally, she grudgingly got to her feet. And that was how she apparently finished the rest of the 1944 season with Bailey Brothers, grudgingly. That tour ended in a surprisingly chilly North Carolina town. Ruth was loaded onto an unheated railroad freight car headed for winter quarters at Brady Lake. She arrived in nearby Ravenna, Ohio, on a gray, raw Thanksgiving Eve. Ruth was walked the 4 miles to the park. She arrived before the rest of the circus troupe hit town. There was no building ready for her, so she spent her nights tethered outdoors to the park gambling hall next to the lake. Her new home, unhappily, would come too late. Ruth had come down with a cold over the past several weeks. She died shortly after arriving on the grounds of the amusement park. No one knows where she was buried. There are lots of opinions even today. Some residents say it was under the first big turn of the roller coaster. Others say she was dragged into the lake. Circus historian Bob Klein says back then it would have been very difficult for a tractor or truck to drag or push the 3-ton carcass very far. He estimates that she couldn't have been moved much more than a half-mile or so before a tractor motor would have burned out. The lake is deep enough to hold her remains, but she couldn't have been dragged far enough out into the lake to where her body would sink. In December, there wasn't much ice on the lake. So the mystery will remain. Somewhere on or near the site of the old park, they apparently dug a hole, probably about 12 feet wide by 12 feet long and around 10 feet deep. That's where Ruth, aka Linko, most likely remains today. Ruth's untimely demise created a problem for Bob Stevens. Once more, he was without a headline-grabbing elephant. Stevens added that to his list of things to do for the 1945 season. By early December 1944, Stevens and dozens of circus workers had arrived in Brady Lake for winter quarters. They had much to do before the rest of the circus troupe would arrive in March for the start of the 1945 season. Stevens had proved he could develop and run a circus. With a 5-month off-season, he was looking to produce a seriously upgraded show, one that would make both headlines and money. He had one thing going for him that he hadn't had earlier, a full season of syndicate money. During the circus's 5 months at Brady Lake, Stevens would spend more than $50,000 getting ready for the next season. He needed more and better transportation and equipment. He needed more and better performers, and he needed more and better animal acts. He spent much of his time at Brady Lake Park and at Ed Kleinman's office in Cleveland working the phones. He purchased new tents, new lighting, and new seating. The show would now seat almost 5,000 customers. The crew at the amusement park was also working hard. Equipment, trucks, cages, vans were repaired, reconfigured, refitted, repainted. Newly acquired tractor trailers and buses had to be reconfigured into quarters for people or animals. The show would now travel with 36 trucks, 16 of them new, including a newly configured 30-foot sleeper truck for the band. After a number of weeks, a reporter visited the circus's quarters at Brady Lake.
The park grounds are a veritable beehive of activity. Noise greets onlookers as they browse around the grounds. Carpenters are busy making repairs and making new supports for seats under the big top, the Ravenna Evening Record.
The old amusement park was hardly the most efficient worksite for a circus. One could only imagine the reaction of the crew and the performers when they first saw it. Most of the park was stuffed into a narrow sliver of land hugging the lake. It was cluttered with buildings, midways, and rides. The roller rink, funhouse, arcade, and gambling hall were not easily transformed into machine shops, maintenance garages, or painting areas. They weren't intended to be used for practicing aerial acts or setting up lion cages or housing wild animals. Most of the buildings weren't even heated. And working out of doors certainly wasn't much of an option. It was Northeast Ohio. There was wind, ice, snow, and freezing temperatures. In addition, food, machine parts, supplies, just about anything the crew needed had to be brought in from Ravenna or Kent, or maybe even Akron or Cleveland. The amusement park was a wonderful summer resort. Brady Lake was a lovely little community. Neither was intended to be used for the winter quarters of a major circus. Bob Stevens told people it cost more than $3,000 a day to operate the circus, keep it on the road, pay employees, and provide food for staff and animals. That's some $50,000 today. It was an expensive operation, and Stevens was about to spend even more of the syndicate's money. By late January 1945, he was focused on adding performers and animal acts to his show. First task, replace Ruth the elephant. If Ruth had been a character, so was the act that took her place. Indeed, if there was one thing mob money seemed to be buying consistently for the circus, it was characters. Stevens found that one of the top elephant acts in the country was available, and it had not one, but 3 Asian elephants: Modoc, Empress, and Judy. All were young, all tipped the scale north of 3 tons. The trio had national reputations even before they became Bailey Brothers stars, especially the ringleader, Modoc. 3 years earlier, in 1942, the threesome was to appear at a charity circus in Wabash, Indiana. They were tethered outside a building when a pack of barking dogs ran by. The three elephants became startled, broke free from their restraints, and began to run. What followed is the stuff of history in that section of the country, even today. Empress and Judy strolled together for a bit, but they found backyards and trash cans enticing. Within 20 minutes, they were back in captivity, munching hay. Modoc, on the other hand, smelled roasting peanuts in a nearby store. She ambled over and bullied her way through what had been the front door. Modoc knocked over the peanut roaster and indulged herself. Then she smashed a hole in the back wall and ran off into the countryside. The chase was on. Over the next 4 days, Modoc barnstormed over Indiana farmlands. Her truck took her through 3 counties and 30 square miles. Farmers, police officers, circus workers, children, even the governor of Indiana joined what had become a game of hide and seek. But it wasn't easy to corral a skittish 3-ton elephant on the lam. At times, the search parties lost track of her in the woods and brush. At other times, they got close to capturing her, only to have her take off again. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of the runaway pachyderm. Finally, on the 5th day, Modoc apparently had seen enough of the country. She was enticed into a van by an offer of 60 loaves of bread and the presence of her running mates, Empress and Judy. That night, Modoc was given 30 gallons of water, lots of hay, and 6 quarts of whiskey for her frazzled nerves. For 1 week, she and her compatriots were the most famous elephants in the country. Now, 3 years later, they were joining the Bailey Brothers Circus at its winter quarters in Brady Lake, and they still couldn't keep out of trouble. When they arrived at Brady Lake in late March 1945, there was no place to house 3 elephants at the amusement park. Somehow, the circus crew hooked up with a resident of nearby Kent, Ohio. They arranged to house Modoc, Empress, and Judy in a cement block building behind his house. Every morning, the 3 girls were walked the 2+ miles to Brady Lake Park to be cleaned and trained. Then they were walked back to their temporary home. Elephants, however, aren't especially quiet or neat. The noise, commotion, and smell created by the trio quickly became a source of neighborhood conversation and distraction. Complaints quickly reached Kent City Council. At its first meeting in April 1945, members passed an emergency resolution outlawing elephants in the city. They didn't have to be concerned for long, though. The circus was scheduled to leave Brady Lake a short time later. Modoc, Empress, and Judy did not work alone, of course. They had a nationally known trainer. Stevens hired her, too. Dolly Jacobs was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. For years, she had been charming circus audiences across the country as the Princess of Pachyderms. Her act was first-rate and highly popular. Dolly was an elephant empress, circus talk for an attractive woman who performed with, rode, and presented elephants during the show. She also was a trainer, specializing in big cats and elephants. She was married to Terrell Jacobs, an internationally known animal trainer for Ringling Brothers and other circuses. They were the parents of twins. In early 1945, while Bob Stevens was negotiating a contract with Dolly, she was suing her husband for divorce. They were in the middle of a juicy and highly publicized legal battle. In sensational court testimony, Dolly charged her husband with having a violent temper and drinking too much. She claimed he beat her even when she was pregnant. He denied it all and professed his continuing love for her. It was Dolly's property demands, though, that generated most of the attention. She wanted the divorce, she wanted custody of the twins, and she wanted alimony. There was nothing particularly newsworthy about any of that. But Dolly was a businesswoman and performer. She had other demands. She wanted the 3 elephants, Modoc, Empress, and Judy. She wanted a lioness named Sheba, a horse named Boy Blue, and a Great Dane named Princess, along with props, a training cage, and an elephant truck. Dolly eventually got everything she asked for. So did headline writers across the country. Stevens, meanwhile, signed other nationally known acts, including Dorothy Herbert, a beautiful blonde equestrian who would later star with Ringling. He added more animals to the menagerie. He hired more clowns. He beefed up the sideshow with a minstrel band, a snake charmer, a sword swallower, and dancing girls, along with a variety of human oddities and curiosities.
More exciting sideshow. Exciting show you've ever seen, and plenty of time to see it all.
Then he turned his attention to the final big audience draw, a top-notch lion tamer. In the 1940s, there were 3 of them: Clyde Beatty, Terrell Jacobs, Dolly's soon-to-be ex-husband, and Captain Ernest Engerer. The first 2 were, respectively, unavailable or inappropriate. Stevens signed Engerer. He was 52, an unimposing 5 feet tall and 120 pounds. But he was a powerful draw for the circus. In his early years of working with big cats, Engerer had been attacked by a lion and lost his left arm. He became known as the one-armed lion tamer. While he was with Bailey Brothers, he began training a young woman, Gladys Gillum, who wanted to be a lion tamer. Gillum was not a newcomer to the world of entertainment, nor was she a shrinking violet. She was another character who fit right in with the rest of the growing cast. After graduating from high school, she tried her hand at being a racetrack jockey, unsuccessfully. Then she took a crack at women's wrestling and found her calling. It didn't take her long to develop a large, devoted fan base and to acquire a nickname, Killum Gillum. She was always portrayed as the bad guy, not permitted to win. For 5 years, she traveled the country as a top draw on the women's professional wrestling circuit. By 1944, she was looking to expand her business horizons. She joined the Bailey Brothers Circus and became a student of Captain Engerer. Gillum, it turned out, was very good at working with lions. So good, in fact, that when Engerer later moved on to another circus, Gillum took his place and became a headliner in her own right. For the next 15 years, she meandered her way between two careers, wrestling and lion taming. When her circus days were over, she went back to wrestling. This time, though, it was alligators. By late March 1945, Bob Stevens had his new show lined up. There was growing anticipation at Brady Lake about the upcoming season that would start in just a few weeks. Performers were arriving at Brady Lake almost daily. Parking lots were filling up with trucks, trailers, and campers. Acts were being created and refined. Clowns were practicing new routines. On April 5th, Stevens opened the winter quarters to the press and public for a limited dress rehearsal. A reporter was excited, but also somewhat disappointed.
Next best thing to attending a circus and attempting to watch 3 rings at once is seeing a circus prepare for its grand opening. There is one disappointing feature about watching Bailey Brothers Circus prepare for its spring takeoff, and that is not all of the acts are there, and only part of the animals are on the grounds. The Ravenna Evening Record.
The caravan pulled out of Brady Lake on April 7th, bound for its opening date in West Virginia. After that first performance, the circus traveled almost 12,000 miles, zigzagging through 11 states for 7 months. On Memorial Day, it was in Sydney, Ohio. On July 4th, Appleton, Wisconsin. On Labor Day, Asheville, North Carolina. On October 31st, it gave its final performance in Darlington, South Carolina. The 1945 version of the circus was a huge success, probably beyond Bob Stevens' expectations. Circuses usually gave 2 shows a day. Bailey Brothers often had to do more.
Turnaways were common throughout the season. There were several stands where 4 shows a day were given, and many where 3 were necessary. Billboard Magazine.
A potentially profitable season for Stevens and the Syndicate, however, had problems. Major unanticipated expenses that popped up and cut deeply into profits. Less than a week after leaving Brady Lake, a truck carrying tent poles for the Big Top was demolished in a traffic accident in West Virginia. 2 days later, another tractor-trailer crash occurred. This one was much more serious. A man standing by the highway was killed. A circus worker driving the truck suffered a broken back. Several large lighting units were destroyed. 2 months later, in Pennsylvania, a tier of seats cracked, sending dozens of customers tumbling to the ground. 5 were hospitalized. In October, a week before the season ended, several hundred customers again were thrown to the ground when bleachers collapsed in North Carolina. 12 people were hospitalized. The circus was sued by customers in both cases. The settlements were expensive. Stevens faced an even bigger lawsuit a month later. A North Carolina farmer charged that the circus was responsible for the farmer's underage son doing what most American boys would love to do: run away to work for the circus. The father asked for some $20,000, about $300,000 today. Once more, Stephen settled out of court. The accidents and litigation took attention away from the fact that in 1945, Bailey Brothers Circus established itself as a quality, popular, entertaining show. Whether it was making Stevens or its owners any money was another question. The day after its last performance, many in the troupe were headed for the 1945 winter quarters. It would not be at Brady Lake Park. The circus had new quarters in a huge American Legion fairgrounds in Newberry, South Carolina. Stevens and crew were effusive in their praise of the new place. It was sprawling. It had a number of large buildings and barns. It had lots of parking. And it was in a warm climate. Compared to the primitive features and frosty temperatures at Brady Lake, it had to seem heaven sent. The circus industry was a steady and impermanent. It was the nature of the business. Circuses hurried into one city, set up, performed, tore down, and hurried to the next city. They changed names, merged, went out of business, and came back to life. Performers moved from show to show. Sometimes they wanted more money. Sometimes they wanted better billing. Sometimes they just wanted a change. In early 1946, that's what Kleinman and the Cleveland Syndicate wanted. Whatever their reason had been for buying the circus, making money legally, making money illegally, or hiding money, the owners weren't satisfied with the results. The winter of 1944 was the only time a circus would call Brady Lake home. Bailey Brothers spent 5 frigid months there only because the syndicate owned the amusement park and thought it was as good a place as any to house the circus for the winter. The syndicate might have been good at running coin-operated businesses, laundries, construction companies, and gambling joints, but it's clear no one really knew anything about running a circus. In May 1946, Kleinman filed papers dissolving the company and ending the relationship. Truck circuses almost never made their owners tons of money. The syndicate discovered that, cut its ties, took a tax loss, and moved on to another opportunity. Bob Stevens looked for and found a new financial backer. What then had the partners gotten out of their 2-year relationship? The circus got the better deal. With the syndicate's considerable financial backing, Stevens was able to put together an entertaining show and establish a national reputation. Kleinman and the syndicate did not fare as well. Circuses, it turned out, were expensive to operate. There were just too many unexpected costs that cut into profits. Traffic accidents, equipment losses, personal injury lawsuits. What the syndicate owned for a short time was a small piece of Americana, a traveling spectacle, replete with colorful characters, human and animal. A circus owner who changed his name to hide from someone or something in the past. An elephant empress who sensationally divorced her husband and got 3 elephants, a horse, a lion, and a Great Dane for alimony. A one-armed lion tamer who was replaced by a woman wrestler named Killam Gillum. And 4 captivating elephants. Cranky Ruth, who was struck by a streetcar and laid down in the middle of traffic, and who caught a cold and died shortly after arriving at Brady Lake. And 3 other elephants, Modoc, Empress, and Judy, who were responsible for a new law in Kent, Ohio, banning wild animals in the city. They all provided fascinating backstories, but little return on investment. It just wasn't enough to keep the syndicate interested or willing to plow more money into the venture. The show, as they say, would go on, but without the Cleveland Syndicate. In the end, it's hard to believe that a circus was indeed ever here at Brady Lake, even for just a short time. There's nothing left at the site of the old amusement park to show for it. Maybe the bones of old Ruth the elephant somewhere. Yet, it's still fun to close your eyes and pretend, if for just a moment, that you can hear the booming voice of the ringmaster. The roars of the big cats, and the oohs and ahs of the crowd. It'll take you back in time to when the circus came to Brady Lake.